Great. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think a few people will still be settling in over the next few minutes, but we may as well get started. Clearly, Jonathan needs to settle in a little bit, too. Well, my name is Matt Bannock, and I'm the managing partner at the Omidyar Network. I shared the stage last year with Maya Chorangal and Jonathan Sneezy.
We have 6 dwarves.
Yes, there are 6. And last year we talked to this group about the exciting development of the creation of a task force established by G8 countries to promote the development, engage with government to promote the development of impact investing. We also announced the formation of a U.S. National Advisory Board and described to the group how we were quite optimistic about the potential of coming forward with a set of recommendations to government that might advance the cause of impact investing. So we're here today to give you an update. And I'm delighted to have several real leaders in the field join me on stage here to talk about what's been accomplished in the past year, and perhaps more importantly, to talk about what the future prospects are, both for the report itself and also for the ways in which the report can drive the sector forward. So I'm delighted to be joined from your left to right by John Goldstein, the Managing Director of Imprint Capital, by Dave Chen, the co-founder and principal of Equilibrium Capital, by Maya Chorangal, the co-founder of Elevar Equity, Jonathan Greenblatt is the Director of the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation at the White House, and Sir Ronald Cohen, who's the Board Director for Big Society Capital and also the chairman of the task force convened by the G8 on impact investing. So looking forward to an exciting conversation. We're going to dispense with any presentations, any formal presentations. The format basically here, I'll ask each of my colleagues a targeted question about the implications for the National Advisory Report for their work. And then I'll ask the panelists an open question. And then we'll hopefully turn to the audience and have about 25 minutes or so for Q&A from the audience. So with that, we'll just sort of dive in. So here is the report. The National Advisory Board, the U.S. National Advisory Board, did its work and produced a report entitled Private Capital and Public Good. How do you leverage private capital in service to public good, in service to society? And we're very excited about not only the recommendations that came forward, but also the sense of community, frankly, that arose from having 27 practitioners in the field, from foundations to the private sector to government, engage on a set of issues that we all care deeply about. Now, let me start with you, John. You have been quite active in a whole host of areas in impact investing, but you've also taken a particular interest in pension reform and the role that I believe it is $7 trillion of pension fund assets in the U.S. can play in driving capital flows across a whole host of areas, including potentially impact investing. Talk to us a little bit about the role that ERISA could play in the realm of impact investing and how this report might contribute to some progress in that regard.
Great. And I think just to step back half a step, I mean, for me, partially my lens entering the NAB was a mildly cajoled skeptic. Because I think we all get invited to participate in a lot of initiatives, a lot of efforts. There's a lot of hope for policy reform, but how do we actually come together and get something done? And I think ERISA is a really great example of the NAB actually, speaking of doing a year progress report of not mission accomplished, but mission progressing. And so my experience of it is a lot of you guys look at organizations that are interested in impact investing. The kryptonite that deters many would-be supermen is the waving the vague sense of fiduciary responsibility. And that phrase gets used a lot, and a lot of people just treat it as a de facto, well, we just can't have the conversation. It's a fiduciary issue. And the law of the land around fiduciary issues in the United States is something called ERISA, which regulates multi-stakeholder pension funds. And I think those are a very large class of institutional investor. And ERISA also cascades down to other fiduciaries who look to it even if they're not regulated by it. It's a really, really big issue. Boring acronym, really big issue. And I think we hear about that a lot. And I think the challenge is in 2008, in the waning days of the Bush administration, they issued a letter that said, pension funds, by the way, if you think about these issues, ESG, integrating other factors, that's a really bad idea. And at a time when we hoped that momentum and excitement would pick up, this cast a chilling effect over this market. And so what the NAB basically did is, across looking over a wide range of issues, instead of everyone having their laundry list of my parochial policy concerns, it was, let's elevate what are issues that are impactful, that matter, what would actually move the dial if we could move it, what are addressable, what are dials we can actually move, and elevate and have action plans around those points. And ERISA was a great example where it really came up across a wide variety of participants in the NAB as something that mattered. And as we looked into it, it was actually something that could be addressable. We didn't have to go ask anyone for money. We didn't have to ask Congress to pass a bill. It's really clarifying guidance. And so that was kind of step one of the NAB process, is really elevating, crystallizing, and finding something that's important and is potentially addressable. And then the second thing was getting sort of tactical around what do you do about it. And we had a great meeting in the White House in June with a lot of members of the NAB, I think most everyone that's here today on stage, to really elevate it up, where we got an audience with the Secretary of Labor, who is the key stakeholder, and really got to make our case. In some ways, he made it easy. His introductory remarks to the group said, I've been meeting with business owners all around this country, and he didn't know what we were going to talk to him about, right? Other than impact investing. He said, I've been struck by, they tell me about these these great practices they're doing that are good and actually make them money. And the Labor Secretary went on about maybe, to be frank, an extended riff, a little beyond time allocation, on enlightened self-interest as a really important part of this work. And I said, funny you should mention that, which is there's a little bit of a regulatory own goal standing in the way of investors pursuing enlightened self-interest, and it happens to be something you could do something about. And we made that case, and that in turn, be able to crystallize, elevate this, and make the right case to the right decision maker has really helped a next wave process unfold where, frankly, based on John Goldstein's wonderful persuasion, he's not going to pull out his pen, but a process to study it, look at the issues, and concretely have a game plan for addressing it has unfolded since then. And I think what's been great for me is getting a chance to see something that, frankly, has been an issue that we bump into it over and over again, the NAB as a vehicle to really crystallize it, lift it up, and have an action plan moving forward that, I'm not the best prognosticator of policy outcomes, but I think I feel good about the momentum. I think we've gotten the right hearing from the right people, and we have a game plan moving forward.
So it's not just a report. Actually, we want results here.
Yeah.
And the progress on ERISA and the audience we have in the administration is a good example of where this actually may result in some concrete steps that could potentially have a huge impact. Dave, let me turn to you. I mean, you're a leader in the environmental sphere, and obviously environmental sustainability is a significant component of impact investing. And as you think of issues such as smart subsidy and attracting private capital, is there anything in the NAB report that you think is particularly important for the work that you do?
Yeah, I think first it's important, I think, to put in perspective just how important governmental policy and smart subsidies are, and how we jokingly, I think, sometimes say, or maybe say it with a little bit of hyperbole, just how powerful capitalism and the market mechanism is. And I think we've just recently here in the U.S. lived out in the last 13, 14 years a great example of that. I think it always shocks people to know that between 2000 and 2013, this country has implemented somewhere close to 75, 80 gigawatts of renewable energy. And I think it also shocks people that of the 28 or 30 states in the United States that put in a renewable portfolio standard, which at the time when these were put in place, and for those of you that aren't familiar with renewable portfolio standards, they were legislation that was put in place in general in the 2000s that dictated that the state's energy generation, that is their utility industry, would have an X percentage of their generation capacity, in this case, supplied by renewable standards. So in this case, wind and solar generally. And when those laws were passed in 2000, 2001, 2002, I can tell you the little thought bubble that went over everybody's head, which was 10% of our generation capacity in Iowa or Texas or 25% here in California. Boy, that just doesn't seem possible. So I think it shocks people that not only did we implement 75, 80 gigawatts, but that 20 of the 28 states actually hit theirs. And I think it's surprising to folks that California so far exceeded the 25%. They raised it to 33. And so the next shocker is, what does 80 gigawatts cost? And 80 gigawatts is about $400 billion, $500 billion of private capital. And so we use that term that the market is one of the most effective mechanisms in the world. And we sort of think about it in hyperbole. And here it is in our country that in the last 14 years, we've seen the deployment of upwards of $400 or $500 billion into our renewable energy portfolio. So taking this back to the question, this is a case where government subsidy, government incentives, in this case the investment tax credits, the production tax credits, have actually had an incredible catalytic effect on the market. I think we've seen similar things happen in Germany, in Japan, and to take a step back, this isn't the first time that great government incentives have actually catalyzed massive markets. And I think the report does, I think, a couple of things really that are important. You know, there's an old term in training, which is to make a conscious competency. Sometimes we're competent, we just don't know why. And I think one of the things that the report does is that it causes a conversation about the stages of market development and what kinds of capital are appropriate at every stage and what kinds of incentives are appropriate at every stage. And if, in fact, they're successful at the development of the idea, the first piloting of the first transactions, the first emerging subsidized transactions, then can we go off the incentives and actually create a legitimate mainstream capital private marketplace. And I think the report does a nice job of really explaining the proper roles that the various foundation capital, donor capital, incentive capital, first pilot capital, and then ultimately mainstream plays in that role.
Your last point is a great one, because so often these different sectors play in isolation of one another. And obviously the report is intended to bring in the public sector more wholly into the discussion, the debate. But in the process, we also engage between the private sector, the foundation world, and others. And I think that was a really constructive dialogue and built a lot of really important relationships that should help us going forward.
I think just to touch on that point, I think one of the problems in industry is that we tend to use the word capital as if it's a omnibus. And so we also, there's a human tendency to want to do the grand unifying theorem, which is to sit in a room between private capital and foundation capital and say, how do we work together? And I think one of the things the report does is it's not so much how do we work together, what stage are you supposed to be working at that uniquely capitalizes on your profile, and what stage do I need you to have done something in order for me now to do mine?
Excellent point. Thank you. Maya, turning to the international development front, which was an important component of the report. You and Elevar have been pioneering for many years and investing, including early stage high risk ventures, and have done a remarkable job. How do the recommendations in the report hopefully enable you to be more successful in terms of achieving your objectives and broader social impact?
Thanks, Matt, for the question. I think what's important to highlight is, though, a lot of the emphasis within the U.S. NAB discussions were around domestic issues and domestic policy. You know, as Matt mentioned, the international role, if you will, that the U.S. plays, or that the U.S. government can play, was a very important theme that shouldn't have been avoided. And in some respects, there was some unification, if you will, on the international development theme between the U.S. and NAB and what a lot of the other NABs representing different countries were focused on. So the international sphere is very important to me personally at Elevar, but should be of importance to the U.S. government. And I think what the NAB process did was to bring together practitioners to highlight where we felt work could be done given the different levels that exist today and where change needed to happen. And at Elevar, one of the things that we recognize in our investing work in the developing world is that there is very limited availability of risk capital, and there's very limited availability of flexible capital. And there are, for example, U.S. government agencies like OPIC or USAID, which have played historically a very important role in development issues by providing capital, and to think about how existing streams of funding, how existing government agencies could be used more proactively, more productively to advance the causes that we in the industry thought and saw. We have a special guest with us today.
Yes, I've had panelists drop in, new panelists drop in from time to time, but I've never seen one actually fly in. For those of you in the front, we have a blackbird who's decided to join us. So.
Yeah, and it's an unusual visitor too. It's a beautiful bird. But so one of
He's looking for some crumbs from the government there,
yeah,
Jonathan.
exactly.
Get in line, bird, get in line.
When we say this was an inclusive process.
So one of the things that is highlighted in the report and is becoming a tactical exercise on our part, again, starting with the discussions that we had with the relevant agencies of government, is to think about how you can use the funding sources that come from the U.S. government more flexibly. Inroads are being made. OPIC, which has traditionally been a debt provider to companies that are located in the developing world, is thinking about ways to become more flexible in its approach, how to partner better in order to serve the needs of high-impact, early-stage companies in the developing world. Organizations like USAID are thinking about how to partner with other multilateral agencies to provide risk capital to seed entrepreneurs who are starting businesses in their home countries that also address needs within their home countries, often needs that relate to poverty, development, the environment. And the consensus building that went on within the NAB discussions around exactly how can we be most practical about influencing government to advance what we feel is the real need, which is a gap in the availability of risk capital out in our markets, I think is for me one of the biggest contributions of the NAB process, and will help our work.
Terrific, and that sort of echoes what Dave was saying
Yes.
about different types of capital. So development institutions, governments have actually, in a lot of ways, done some terrific things in the broader sphere of development. But there are still gaps
Yes.
in the market, and there are still some skills that OPIC and others have that can be tapped
Yes.
in a more significant way. So I'm hopeful that this will result in some additional progress there as well.
We are too.
So Maya and Dave and John were all served with me on the National Advisory Board. Now I come to the two real leaders in this field and leaders in this effort, Jonathan and Sir Ronald, who really have conceptualized the notion of the task force and of the national advisory boards. And I and my colleagues here, and I think the industry owes them a debt of gratitude for their leadership. And Jonathan's looking a little skeptical because usually right after I compliment him, I throw in a zinger. And so he's just sort of a little guarded over there. But
No, I'm just watching the bird. A very SOCAP moment.
there you go. You scared him away. So Jonathan, why does this matter to the administration?
So I think, as we talked a little bit about this morning, we believe at the White House, the president himself was very focused on how can we accelerate economic recovery, how can we boost job creation. I would say that there's a lot of things to be pleased about in the context of we're seeing quarter on quarter continued job growth. We had somewhere upwards of 9.9 million jobs created since 2010. I think just in June we recorded the highest number of jobs available in like 13 years in the marketplace. So things are moving in the right direction in many respects in the economy, and yet we are still seeing real challenges with widening income inequality. We're still seeing real challenges with the, if I might, the 99%. We're still seeing real challenges on issues of racial equity as exemplified by what happened last month in St. Louis. We're still seeing real challenges on climate change. So we know there's a lot of work to be done. What's encouraging in my mind about this process is this U.S. Advisory Board was almost like a Simpson-Bowles commission, if you will, of the impact investing space, taking some of the brightest minds from blue chip organizations and bringing together what was essentially a group of very unusual suspects from places like the Ford Foundation, the Case Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, along with people from places like Equilibrium Capital or Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, along with academics and practitioners. And so this blue chip group that developed this list of recommendations now offers us up, if you will, a blueprint of what industry and philanthropy and the academy believe we need to do to advance impact investing and to accelerate economic growth. So the clarity of the recommendations is very helpful for us. The broad representation of the board is incredibly useful. And I think the good news is that we're moving. We are moving to get done a number of the items that were laid out in the report. So for example, the report talked about, in terms of unlocking capital and taking down barriers, expanding the SBIC program. That's a program developed by our Small Business Administration to help provide capital to new venture firms. Some of our greatest brands and most successful businesses of the last several decades, like FedEx or Apple or Starbucks or Intel, these were generated by SBIC-funded firms. So the report recommends expanding the program, and we're doing just that. We have $1 billion impact investing program in the SBIC that we're expanding with an announcement that will happen later this month. The report talked about making it easier for charitable endowments to do program-related investments. So the United States foundations grant or make charitable contributions about $50 billion a year. So that's pretty interesting, $50 billion. What's more interesting is the total aggregate endowment value held by those foundations, as well as universities. It's roughly $750 billion. How can we make it easier for foundations and universities to drive that endowment value toward impact? The report talks about this, and we are now finalizing what's known in the bureaucratic lingo as a rulemaking. Later this year, the Department of Treasury will clarify how this works. And that's incredibly exciting because it unlocks a lot of additional value. And then thirdly, we're going to continue to use our convening power. So as Judith Roden of the Rockefeller Foundation mentioned this morning, we had a roundtable when we announced the report. These folks were there. And we had investment firms in the room who made over $1.5 billion in new commitments to impact investing. So what's interesting about that is, again, some of those people are here at SOCAP. I would point out, like the Transform Finance Network. I know that Morgan Simon and Andrea Armetti are in the room somewhere over there. So you've got groups like the New Belgium Foundation or Pi Investments or new investors who are moving into this space, or folks like Capricorn, Jeff Skoll's private equity firm, or folks like the CREO network of investors, or folks like Abacus Wealth Management. If you don't know these names, that's because they're new to the impact investing space, and they're increasingly moving into it. So we're seeing this field mainstream, and that puts more wind in our sails and creates more, if you will, momentum to do more in the policy space to continue to widen the playing field. Because if we can drive capital that not only creates jobs, but creates stronger communities, we think that's a good outcome for the country.
Terrific. And so, Ronald, the conversation here is focused on the U.S. National Advisory Report. Can you tell us a little bit about how this fits into the broader context of the task force, and perhaps give us a sneak preview into the task force report that's forthcoming shortly?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And just a small request, can we drop the Sir Ronald and just call me Ronnie, like we usually do? That would be great. So I think what you've just heard gives you a sense of what's gone on in every single one of the 8 countries that have contributed to the work of the task force. And when we were asked to catalyze a global market in impact investment, it was very clear to me that this was about creating a revolution. This wasn't about writing a report. And that's why we created these national advisory boards, because the things that they are seeking to do are nothing short of revolutionary. If we do manage to get a change in ERISA legislation, first at the level of this change in regulation, and then subsequently to include within the prudent man rule investments in impact, that'll have huge repercussions. And in every one of our countries, in Australia, in Germany, in France, in Italy, in the UK, in Canada, in every one, in Japan even, in every one of our countries, people are taking initiatives appropriate to their country. In Japan, they're taking unclaimed assets, bank accounts that have been left dormant because their owners have disappeared, and they're using them for victims of the tsunami. We can see in France legislation that came in before the task force compelling those who manage pension fund money to make impact investment offerings to the pensioners. We can see in the UK now tax incentives that are coming in so that you can offset your investment and get a 35% tax break. And what the report is going to do is to bring all these strands together from across the world. And it's going to say what I said this morning, which is we've added impact to risk and return. We're setting impact objectives and we're measuring their achievement. We want to give entrepreneurs who want to improve the lives of others and the planet the same tools that normal business entrepreneurs have had in the past. And to achieve this, we need to make some clear statements about what governments have to do to enable this to happen. And so what will emerge from the report, I hope, is a feeling among all of us across the world who are interested in the same thing, of basically improving the lives of others, that this is compelling and their governments have to do it. And the national advisory boards will, I hope, continue for many years to lead this revolution. When I kicked off in venture capital at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, I felt it was what was in the air, that young entrepreneurs were going to bring new technologies and that it could have real potential. Nobody could have guessed the extent to which in just 4 decades it would transform our lives. I have exactly the same feeling about impact investment. I think none of us today realize just how big the change can be from doing the sorts of things that the National Advisory Board in the United States is now seeking to do. I think this is a seminal moment that we can find ourselves 5, 10 years from now with significant flows of capital to new organizations and existing organizations that want to innovate in delivering services to others. And that bringing impact into the businesses and the not-for-profit organizations that we run or that we participate in, and bringing it in a way that allows it to be measurable and that enables it to be correlated with a financial return is really going to open up the possibility for innovation such as we've really never seen before. And so what I can tell you about the report is that when it appears, I hope people will understand what impact investment is. I hope its importance will resonate with them. And I hope it will make policymakers receptive to the sorts of recommendations that we've heard today. And I really want to congratulate you, Matt, and all your colleagues, all our friends who have sat on the National Advisory Board for a fantastic piece of work, really. It's not just an effort to write the report that you've seen. As you can hear, the revolution is already starting. And I'm very proud to have been associated with you all in this effort.
Thank you, Ronnie. Quick question for the group, and then we'll go to questions from the audience here. If you had 30 seconds with President Obama, and you wanted to, and of course, maybe I should exclude you because you probably have 30 seconds, Jonathan, but still be
You'd be
interested in
cutting
what you have
down
to
his
say.
time. Yeah.
If you had 30 seconds with President Obama, and you wanted to encourage him to move forward aggressively on things that would help accelerate the development of impact investing, what would you say? 30 seconds. And so you can't have more than 30 seconds here, so please.
I would say, don't start my 30 seconds. No. There's a lot of money from a lot of people that would love to make your job in government a lot easier. There's some pretty easy, at a time when you can't get a lot of money from a lot of places, and there's some pretty straightforward things you can do to let them do that, which ranges from getting out of the way, getting rid of self-inflicted barriers to that, and simplifying well-intended regulation that sometimes makes it a little harder for government to play well with the private and philanthropic sectors.
30 seconds, nicely done. Others?
I think two things. One is the ERISA. This is an incredibly small, seems like a small thing, but it is. It's what created effectively the private equity and venture capital industry that we know today. So it's in the minutiae, it's the mundane, but it is incredibly powerful. I think that the second thing is not to be afraid of the use of governmental incentive programs, because there's a long history of very positive, proactive use of government incentives that have had long-standing changes, whether it's the Community Reinvestment Act, whether it's TIF, whether it's the investment tax credit, the production tax credits. What you want to do is be proactive, not to make them handouts or long-term, but to not be afraid of using them, because they can be catalytic.
I would say that one of the hallmarks of the American character is entrepreneurship, and that in the decisions that face government about a variety of topics, whether it's ERISA, whether it's regulation, whether it's how the development agencies work, is to hold that principle of American entrepreneurship at heart, which I think would help to reduce barriers, would help to inform partnerships with the private sector, and to embrace the techniques of entrepreneurship, which are proving, I think, in our market to be so powerful in affecting change.
Great. I can tell you, not exactly what I've said, but what I can say, the conversations that have been had to date go something like this. Impact investing is not a silver bullet. It is not an antidote to all of our ills, but there are market-based models that policy can help to unlock, and we can create the conditions that will allow capital to flow and that will empower entrepreneurs if we get it right. And the benefits of doing so not only are, again, more jobs created and more firms developed, but it's contributing to stronger communities and driving progress on some of our toughest challenges. And so this is a nonpartisan approach that can appeal to everyone and make an impact on the things that we care the most about.
Good. Ronnie?
So I would say, Mr. President, you started off as a community leader, and you know the importance of society. We have a generation that elected you that wants to make a difference. It wants the tools to be able to make that difference. Take government in the direction of pay for success. Take government in the direction of paying out for outcomes, and do it at scale, like everything else which the United States has done.
Terrific. Thank you. As for me, by the way, I would just tell the president to please clone Jonathan Greenblatt because he has, in fact, done such a terrific job in helping engage the administration, engage people such as the people on the stage and a set of really important issues. And I am indeed quite grateful. So I don't know if he could quite work that out, but that would be my ideal. So let's go to the audience. There are probably a couple roving mics. And feel free to raise your hand. I shouldn't have to cold call in an audience of about 150 people. Yes.
Hi. Thank you all very much for all of your hard work over the last several years. My name is Nick Ashburn, and I'm with the Wharton Social Impact Initiative. Earlier this morning, Jonathan, you might have said, call your congressman.
Oh, no, I didn't say that. I can't tell you what to do. I did not say that.
You did not say that.
I simply said there may be legislation on the Hill, which is interesting, but I didn't tell anyone to call anyone.
Sorry.
Let me get on the record as saying just that.
So, who is calling their congressman, or who's on the Hill talking about this? I guess that's my question for the panel.
I think there are a number of interest groups that are out there that are indeed engaged in advocacy. There's a group in town called the U.S. Social Investment Forum, which is engaged in advocacy around a lot of these issues. But I actually think that, and there are many organizations. Enterprise was mentioned earlier this morning, which is advocating on a lot of these issues. But there certainly is a need for new voices to step forward and start to talk about this, and that might be something.
And I would say, I mean, one thing that felt a little different about the NAB and some of the work that came out of it, I think you made this point earlier, was sort of the not as usual suspects. Yeah. And with enough diversity that, well, on the one hand, there's a commonality of an interest in impact investing. It wasn't, here's our laundry list of very narrow parochial things that help my life. Like busy people with busy day jobs trying to lift up what are the things for the industry. And so it seemed like we got a little bit of a different hearing when we talked to some folks on the Hill that are considering legislation, we talked to policymakers, because we weren't wearing our narrow self-interested agendas on our sleeves. It's like, look, these are the things a diverse set of people agreed upon as bubbling up from this field, and it felt like that helped get a little bit of a different hearing. And I think just to continue, there are narrow advocacy groups that have great technical expertise and focus, and that's really important, but complementing that has felt like a useful piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I'll give us maybe just a related area, and I think that in a topic that's also just as much in the legislative sphere, the benefit corporation laws that have been passed now in almost 30 states in the United States. One of the, I think, greatest surprises has been how unanimously across the aisle in almost every state that the benefit corporation laws, which again, to take your point, harnesses entrepreneurship for social good. It's been really quite shocking in a pleasant way how bipartisan and how uniform of a chord this strikes. And in almost every state, these laws have been passed unanimously.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I think as we're fond of noting, is impact investing is not an issue of the right or of the left. It's about solutions to issues that we care about. It's about human beings, right? And it's terrific to see that we can get that kind of bipartisan support. Other questions?
Yeah, John Nelson with...
Oh, I'm sorry?
John Nelson with Wall Street Without Walls. I know most of you on the panel, and hello. Thank you for your good work through the years. Policy is obviously hugely important, and we can wring an awful lot of money out of the bank settlements, for example. And one of my advisors, Fred Cooper, suggested that we allocate a certain percentage of the bank settlement money and we put it into maybe a guarantee fund for the CDFIs or CDCs to be able to redeploy private capital. So it's a way of leveraging capital, and there are many other examples of that where the federal government they guarantee about $1.3 trillion a year. They could probably do some more guarantee work that would help leverage the impact investor even better by providing a credit enhancement.
I mean, I think John's right. I mean, I think there's more that can be done. I think the Pay for Success Fund we were talking about this morning will help. But you're right. I mean, and part of what I think the challenge that we have, and maybe one could say the opportunity is, there are trillions of dollars in private capital that could be allocated toward creating an impact in some of these areas that we're trying to facilitate and unlock. And we need to do that in ways that are smart. We need to do that in ways that are responsible to make sure that happens in ways that support the most vulnerable and can assist communities in need. But get it right, and as Dave was saying, the incentives are there. We can use incentives to really drive impact.
Hello, my name is Célia Cruz from Brazil. We launched the Brazilian Social Finance Task Force inspired by your movement, and there were in your plans some kind of call for the G20. So I'd like to know, because it went out, what's your plans?
So we're very keen for the G20, which includes a lot of developing countries, the most important countries really today. And we're very keen for the initiative to come from the G20. It's proving difficult to get the political forces to achieve that. The leadership of the G20 is a crucial element in that, obviously. And if you can manage to organize an effort with similar, people and organizations across G20 countries, that would be extremely valuable, because if, as the report emerges, there's a clamor for it, then it's a natural thing for this task force to extend to the G20, to include G20, to expand the activity, replicate the model that we've created across, the G7 plus Australia, replicate that. And I think it's very important to do that, because I think when you look at countries like Brazil or Mexico or India, and many others, there's huge potential. I was asking somebody in the UK a couple of days ago, which country do you think is going to emerge as the leader in impact investment, right? It crosses over entrepreneurship and social motivations, and it's for profit and it's not for profit. The answer was Brazil. The answer was Brazil. I think Brazil will surprise everyone, that person said. So if we want the revolution to happen, it's very important that it goes to the countries that can, in many ways, benefit the most, you could say, from it. And it requires leadership. I think what we've learned from the effort over the last 14 months, it doesn't require just government leadership. It requires the leadership of government, of social sector organizations, of for-profits, profit with purpose companies of one kind or another, of foundations, of banks, of new intermediaries that come in. And if you can manage to galvanize that effort across different countries, then the revolution will happen soon. But if we go one by one trying to persuade certain sectors from doing it, it's going to take much longer. And what will accelerate the process is having international examples. One of the reasons this was such a brilliant idea on the part of Prime Minister Cameron is that if you think about how you develop this whole effort quickly, it's by getting different countries to do specific things that work in their countries, and others looking and saying, hey, we should be doing this, or we should be doing something similar. You move a lot faster than if you were concentrating on one country only. And that applies to the G20 that you raised. So we're now relying on you. You're the agent of that revolution.
Hi, David Bank with ImpactAlpha.com. I'm interested in the ERISA question. It strikes me that there's something a little defensive about it, because it presupposes that you're giving the fund managers the right to seek lower returns. I think that's what they're trying to protect against, right? Is there a way that, well, let me just ask the question, and let me ask it as a question then, John. Is there a way to just to work that and say fiduciary responsibility actually requires things like long-term investment horizons, like comprehensive risk analysis, like understanding environmental sustainability? Is there a way to flip it from you are able to incorporate those considerations to, in fact, you must incorporate those considerations?
I can give my 2 cents as a profoundly inexpert person on these topics from a legal or technical perspective. But I think as we think about the narrative arc of the fiduciary ask, I think that's the goal, right? And once upon a time early in the process, I kind of laid out my dream, right, which is sort of it's kind of a three-part statement, which is, number one, there's absolutely nothing incompatible in the thoughtful integration of environmental, social governance, or impact factors as part of a well-managed investment process. Number two, evidence is emerging that in fact there may be greater fiduciary risk in neglecting to consider these factors and including them. And three, certain classes of fiduciaries may have an affirmative responsibility to find more constructive ways to leverage capital to advance their social purpose. I think there's an end game that is farther. But step one is some people, for whatever reasons, went and planted a big loud flag in bright capital letters on the beach saying, "Don't swim." And so before we teach people the wonders of swimming and give them stroke clinics, it's just let's get the flag out of the way so people can feel safe going in the water, and then we're going to go to the succession of that. I mean, that would be my totally inexpert, non-official perspective on that. I would turn to the rest of the gang.
I would just say one quick thing. This isn't going to, my thought on this would be, you'll never see ERISA reform, if you will, if there isn't a clear case made that this is about driving alpha. If the conversation is about, are we trading off on returns, it simply won't fly. You need the economic data, you need the fund analysis, you need a clear case to be made that the reason why we need to update this and remove the flag, if you will, is that it's not about a trade-off, it's really about trading up. And when that case gets made in a rigorous way, in a quantitative way, that will be the compelling data that in large part should neutralize what some of the doubts, if you will, and the uncertainty that's pervaded and created the flag.
And then large asset managers work to create product to serve that demand, which drives better performance, which drives more behavior, that gets you in that cycle.
I think were you going to say something, Dave?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think from our perspective, what we're seeing is sort of two behavior patterns and this is sort of part of the change process, right? There's always going to be a few that are pushing the bounds and asking the questions. And we're watching, frankly, some of the largest pension plans in the world asking a very fundamental question, which is the core of fiduciary duty is the duty of care and duty of loyalty. Nowhere is it actually written that the fiduciary duty is to make money. And one of the things that they've done with that duty of care and duty of loyalty is to ask themselves, if we in fact are holders of capital and responsibility for long periods of time, like a pension plan, and we are now in possession of material knowledge that is in duration match to our obligation. In other words, let's take an easy one, climate change. If we now, and again, this has nothing to do with whether it's man-made or not, it just has to do with, is in fact there statistically significant that stuff is happening? And if that's going to happen within the time frame that we are in fact fiduciaries in our duration, then if we don't consider it as part of our investment decision, then we are actually in breach of duty and care. And we're watching some of the most progressive and aggressive large capital bases asking this question because they're now concerned. Then there's going to be the entire other basket of fiduciaries that unless the law or some permission granting is made, they're just not going to move. And then there's a basket of folks that are saying, whether there's a law or not, within the confines of what we think is our obligation and the legal code, we think we have to act. And we're watching a couple of those very, very significant influencers making those plays right now.
Thank you. We have time for one final question.
Yeah, thanks. Jim Davidson. I was struck by the comment that this was encouraging nonpartisan issue, and I just want to challenge that question that it's nonpartisan when you think about so many of these, especially using tax as a policy tool, which is our most common tool, it seems. Every time you do a subsidy of some form, you create a constituency, it creates a whole political process. I'm trying to look for more evidence of why I should be enthusiastic that this truly is a nonpartisan opportunity here.
So you want to speak to that?
Well, I think, Jim, I think it's a reasonable question to ask, and it's good to be skeptical about this, certainly based on the way things seem to be unfolding in Washington. I think what I would point to, that at least the evidence to date, there's some really encouraging signs. So as we talked about a little bit earlier, we've got legislation now on the Hill in support of social impact bonds, this pay for success model we're trying to drive, that have been proposed by Republicans and Democrats. On the Senate side, Orrin Hatch is the sponsor of this bill. He'll be the incoming chair of the Finance Committee if the Senate changes hands in November. We've got other folks who are proponents of this, people like Rand Paul, who is having conversations in the Senate side about the for-benefit corporation model that Dave was talking about. We've got 24 state houses across the United States where Republicans and Democrats have gotten behind, new legislation to create the for-benefit piece. What I have found is that some folks, let's say of the right, are interested in market-based models. Some folks in the left are interested in tackling tough social problems. There seems to be promise that this approach can bring both of those worlds together.
And I have one last thing I want to say, because I think you would be too bashful to say it, but I think as we talk about the NAB and the work that's done, I think it's just important to acknowledge Omidyar and Matt and Paula and Rosita and Lauren worked really, really tirelessly over a long period of time to make this all happen, and we all played our little parts. But I think it just bears underscoring the phenomenal role that ON played in really making this happen.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And with that, I would like to just thank my panelists and thank you all for your time and attention. It's a really critical set of issues. We think we're poised at a very important moment, and please join us where you can to help move the sector forward. So thank you all very much.